Well, back in the 1920s, there were two great American pastimes. One was baseball, of course, and the other, boxing. Every kid knew the great boxers, and not just the heavyweights. Every championship fight was a major event. On September 22nd, 1927, Chicago was host to the biggest boxing match and most controversial bout ever, when Jack Dempsey fought Gene Tunney for the World Heavyweight Championship. It was a fight where one boxer was not counted out at 10. He spent more than 14 seconds down on the canvas, and he still went on to win the fight. Tonight, Chicago Stories takes a look at how it happened. John Calloway narrates the long count.
Chicago, September 22nd, 1927. Babe Ruth is on his way to being the first to hit 60 home runs in a season. But the biggest sports story in the country is a boxing match at Soldier Field. It is a fight promoter's dream. Jack Dempsey, the popular favorite and one-time champion, trying to regain the heavyweight crown from a Shakespeare-reading Marine, Gene Tunney. The seventh round of this match will be the most debated and controversial 3 minutes in boxing history. As the fight is getting underway at Soldier Field, one Chicago kid is already on the edge of his seat.
I'm 15 years old. My brother's about 5, 6 years older. And he and a gang of guys around the neighborhood had gathered around that radio. Graham McNamee is the announcer. There are about 10 of us around the radio listening to the fight.
Ladies and gentlemen, main event for the heavyweight championship of the world.
50 million people heard Graham McNamee call that fight, more than had ever listened to one man's voice.
From Salt Lake City, Utah, former heavyweight king, Jack Dempsey.
We're rooting for Dempsey. His name was synonymous with heavyweight champion, you know. What was appealing about him, he was a bum originally. He rode the rods, rode the trains, couldn't hold jobs. So I think it was the fact that guy rose from us, from the ranks, the blue-collar ones, the kids.
Well, Dempsey was one of the first great sports stars of the 20s. Was bigger than Babe Ruth. It's hard to imagine today, but you're talking about a guy that Babe Ruth was actually jealous of because he was the story much more so than Babe Ruth. His fights were events. Captains of industry, celebrities, they all came out to watch Jack Dempsey.
They certainly came out to Soldier Field that night. Special planes and trains were chartered from all over the country. Every hotel room in town was booked. 20,000 police officers were on hand to maintain order at Soldier Field.
Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, all friends of Dempsey, all came out.
Most of the hoopla, it seemed, was for Jack Dempsey, and yet Gene Tunney was the world champion.
His opponent from New York City, heavyweight champion of the world, Gene Tunney.
Gene Tunney had won the heavyweight crown from Jack Dempsey the previous year. Dempsey had held the title for 7 years. His legions of fans were not happy to hear that Tunney had won in Philadelphia.
Well, reaction was horror, sadness, grieving. You know, Tunney, who the hell is Tunney? This boxer, light heavyweight champion he was, a good boxer, and he had power, but not Dempsey.
It didn't matter that Tunney was clearly the better fighter in that first fight. People just wouldn't have it. They wanted Jack Dempsey to be champion and grew to resent Tunney just for being a title holder.
But many boxing fans had another reason to dislike Gene Tunney. He came off as an intellectual, reading Shakespeare and talking to the press in formal, pretentious language. When a reporter asked him about an upcoming fight, Tunney acted insulted and insisted that it wasn't a fight, it was a boxing contest.
Most people disliked Gene Tunney because they felt that the intellectual act was more of a put-on, and they just didn't appreciate it. They felt he was kind of above the fray and that he really wasn't one of them. There were even sports writers, I think, that disliked Gene Tunney. He just wasn't the typical boxer.
The irony is, Tunney was an intellectual. And this is George Bernard Shaw, who admired Gene Tunney. He wrote to Bernard Shaw, and Bernard Shaw liked what he said in the letter. Shaw wrote an early play about a boxer, and Tunney said, "You were immature in boxing." And Shaw says, "You're right," and he invited him. And Tunney and he corresponded, discussed Shakespeare, and Tunney met H.G. Wells and the others, and held his own with them. So he actually was an intellectual.
The Philadelphia fight was not only a win for Gene Tunney, but it also made millions for the legendary fight promoter Tex Rickard, the man who built and owned Madison Square Garden.
Tex Rickard was the greatest promoter ever in boxing. Even today, he is Don King times 10. Tex Rickard saw the receipts of the first fight, knew that a rematch would make him even more money, and decided that the most money he could possibly make would happen with a fight in Chicago. They wanted the fight in New York, but New York had a ceiling on how much they would charge for fights. $27.50 was the top price for a ticket. Well, Chicago came a-calling and said, hey, we can charge $40 for a ringside seat.
$40 in 1927 would be about $400 today. But when you showed up at Soldier Field with your ringside ticket, you might be in for a surprise.
There were over 100 rows of ringside seats, so just because you had a ringside seat didn't mean that you were right up close for all the action.